Recording from our respective home offices, this is Public Affairs Director Matthew Huffman, and this is Momentum, a webcast produced by your coalition, connecting advocates across our state. In this episode, I am joined by Member Services Director Laura Zahnd, and our special guest today is Dr. Stephanie Logan, Executive Director of DeafLEAD. Laura, Stephanie, welcome.
Thank you, Matthew.
Awesome. Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, thank you both for being on here. I'm really excited to chat with y'all today, and I'm really excited for us to be able to have a conversation about DeafLEAD and all of the amazing work and services you all provide to the state of Missouri.
Thanks a lot. I really appreciate that.
Yeah, well, to get us started, Stephanie, I was hoping that you could just give us an introduction to yourself and also to DeafLEAD.
Yeah, absolutely. I think probably the very first thing, probably the most important, is to explain a little bit of my background. I lost my hearing when I was 23 to spinal meningitis. It was almost 30 years ago now. And consequently, I had to learn American Sign Language because I have a total hearing loss of both ears. And at that time, I had never met a deaf person and I had never seen sign language. And but because of the level of my hearing loss, I had to learn sign language and I had to utilize interpreters. And so actually joining us today are three of the DeafLEAD's interpreters that work at the agency. The one who is interpreting right now is Corinne. And then we also have Corey, who is one of our male interpreters. And then we have Heidi. And so throughout this webcast, each of them at different times will, you'll see them come back onto the screen and they'll interpret for me whatever you are saying. And then when you're done and they're done interpreting it, I will then respond. I've chosen today to voice what I'm saying. It is very difficult to sign and talk at the same time. And my speaking tends to deteriorate if I try to sign and talk at the same time for a long period of time. So because of the topics that we're going to be talking about, I thought I would just voice today, and you had assured me that this would be captioned so that for deaf individuals that would be watching this, that they would be able to have access through the captions for this. So that's what that's why they are here as well. So to go back then to your original question regarding DeafLEAD, right? So when I lost my hearing, I was a student at the University of Georgia, and I had to go to Gallaudet University to learn sign language. And I went there and then went back to the University of Georgia to finish my degree, and they hired interpreters to be able to interpret my classes. And it was after I graduated that I started working. The University of Georgia offered me a job. And I was learning how to develop programs and services for students with disabilities on campus. After a few years, I was doing speech therapy. I was learning more sign language and getting involved in the deaf community. I really realized I wanted to move. I wanted to go actually to Alaska. And so I applied for a job in Alaska, working actually at a deaf agency in Fairbanks. And I also applied for a job in Missouri. And I had never been to Missouri, and quite honestly, maps was not my thing. I did not know where Missouri was, but I applied for the job, and it was for a job as the executive director of a nonprofit agency serving deaf individuals. And I thought, wow, that's really cool. You know, I'm not really sure what all that means, but I decided to go ahead and go for it. I was unbelievably unqualified for the position and very young. And fortunately, I was offered the job. Fortunately or unfortunately, I'm not sure which. For them, back then, I was very, very young and naive and did not know a lot about what it was that I was going to be doing. And I was the first employee. So I was the first executive director of the organization, and I had a donated office space. And it was from that donated office space, actually in Jefferson City, that had no furniture in it or anything, that the seed of the organization began. And I accepted the position that was offered to me. It was actually offered 1 week before the Alaska job was offered. I felt committed to Missouri, so that's why I moved here. And so the very first thing I did was go and buy furniture, my desk for my office and my bookcases that are actually in my office now are the same desks and bookcases from when I bought them 25 years ago. But anyway, that was the seed that was planted then. And the thing that I did back then, and I'm so glad I did, I asked our board of directors, what was it that they wanted? Where did they see the organization in a year, 5 years, 10 years, 50 years? What did they want? And they said they wanted me to fill the gaps in services for the deaf in the state of Missouri. So of course that begs the next question, what services already exist? And back then they said none. There was no services. So, oh my gosh, that's a huge gap. It was really a gift because it really meant tabula rasa, right? I had a clean slate to start with. And so I started with going all around the state of Missouri that first year I was here and meeting deaf individuals, finding out where the pockets of deaf individuals were, going to the School for the Deaf, and determining what did the deaf community identify as the need. And over again, there were two major themes. Number one, mental health services. The deaf community identified how badly they needed mental health access in the state of Missouri. And number two, crisis intervention services. So that included things like domestic violence, sexual violence, child abuse, rape. It was just a myriad of need within the deaf community in terms of crisis intervention. And so those were the two things I focused on, which connected me to MCADSV all those years ago. It was one of the things I found out when I was researching crisis intervention and the state of Missouri, and then having conversations with organizations like shelters in the mid-Missouri area, where they said, oh, you got to talk to MCADSV, which started this relationship that we have today.
Stephanie, thank you for both sharing your individual story as well as the story of DeafLEAD and how you all really got started as an organization. I think it's really fortunate for our state that you ended up here and not in Alaska. So selfishly, I'm glad you got offered that job first. But I also just want to recognize the really hard work that you did whenever you said you spent your first amount of time going around the state to listen to other people and hear what deaf survivors need, what the deaf community really needs, and how you identified those gaps. Something that I really appreciate that you do serving on our membership committee is always bringing that perspective and elevating it on a statewide level.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Thank you very much. You know, I think it is so important to be able to identify what the population that we serve or anybody serves, what do they identify as the need? It's so easy as a provider to go, well, this is what they need, but what do they see as the need, all right? And so that was, as young as I was back then and naive, it was something that I'm glad that I did. And I had a lot of really good support from organizations just like MCADSV, sort of leading me through the path that I eventually led me to get my master's in business administration while I've been at DeafLEAD, and which led me to get my PhD in counseling psychology because we had no deaf psychologist in the state of Missouri. And my board was generous and kind enough to work with me, and the schools were good to work with me to make the work that I was doing at the schools what we were doing at DeafLEAD. And so it was the only way that I was able to get my education while also working at DeafLEAD.
So I want to ask really specifically about a service that DeafLEAD provides, and that's the Missouri Crisis Line. So whenever the pandemic started, I was asked by several journalists what were some of the most important aspects that they needed to be covering specific to domestic and sexual violence survivors. And I've brought up the crisis line several times, and journalists always seem to be a bit surprised to hear about the text line option and what a really important service that is. So, Stephanie, I was wondering if you could talk a bit about that and just why text services are so important.
Yeah, absolutely. We started the crisis text line, which it's the Missouri crisis text line, but is actually accessible nationwide. So anybody who is a victim of crime, hearing or deaf or whatever, can access the crisis texting service by texting 839-863 the word hand, and they get a crisis worker. So why texting? And it was something that, you know, we were talking about as an agency. We had been providing hotline services, but the community that we serve, the deaf community, at the time, everybody had a sidekick, which was a type of, like, not a flip phone, but it went like this. I don't know if you remember it, but and so typing back and forth and texting back and forth was very popular. And so it became a natural next step in meeting the needs for the population that we serve. And so that is why we went into the direction of crisis texting. I would say that 99% of the services that we provide are as a result of a need identified by the community itself. And let's not forget, I am also a deaf individual. And so I am going, you know, this is a need we need to fill. So one thing that's, when you're talking about hearing individuals, and this is really important, that when they call the crisis line and they're talking to someone, so this is a hearing person, sometimes they'll get triggered by the crisis worker's voice. Eliminating that, removing that piece, allows them to be able to text without being triggered. That's a great thing for individuals who are in crisis, who are wanting to utilize that service. In thinking about our younger population, especially now, moving in a digital direction was the right step. So reason number 2. Number 3 is the privacy. So you can literally text from anywhere. You can be anywhere around people and you are protected where you are not as protected when you're on a telephone call, or even when you're doing VP, like we have VP hotlines, and where, you know, in that, a deaf individual sees another crisis worker and they sign back and forth. So whether you're talking or whether you're seeing someone, that's not nearly as private as texting provides. So that's the third. And then fourth, we deal with a large population of individuals when they're calling in crisis and they've been a victim of a crime that are suicidal or that are having thoughts of suicide. And one of the things that texting does is it keeps people's hands busy, right? And so those are the 4 reasons that really, I believe, show just how important it is to provide that service.
Well, and Stephanie, as you're talking about the text line, and I'm thinking about the total accessibility that can provide in so many different areas, you know, one of the things that I've heard you also talk about throughout, you know, the middle of a pandemic here, I've heard you on several meetings talk about accessibility and the use of face masks and how that is a huge challenge for people within the deaf community. And I was hoping you might talk about that a little bit to help whoever's listening to this and other advocates really kind of understand, you know, what those challenges are. And if we're thinking about accessibility, why that text line is so important, why other means of providing services are just as important than our in-person that we're used to doing.
Yeah, we absolutely have to become more creative in the way that we do everything in this post-COVID world, right? And so one of those is offering the texting service, right? Collaborating with other organizations. Whereas I think we kind of made lip service to it before. I think that we're now in a position where it is essential that we are collaborating with other organizations. But I want to touch on the face mask. So that's super important. So in order to understand that, you have to understand American Sign Language itself. So when communicating American Sign Language, 90 to 95% of what is communicated is body language and facial expressions, right? 5 to 10% is the actual sign itself, right? So if I sign the sign nice, right? Nice. And I go, oh, nice. Right? For nice to meet you, right? If I go, right? Not very happy. Or if I go, right? Trying to raise it. I'm trying to have game. I don't know how well it's coming off of Zoom, but I'm raising and lowering my eyebrow. Now we take a mask and we put a mask over our face, and it's not just covering here, it's covering all the way up to here. So all we're left with is this part. And so we've removed a great deal of what is part of the communication process in American Sign Language. And so I've seen things like the masks that have the clear, for lip reading. Now, I was specifically talking about American Sign Language. You also have individuals, and I'm one of them, who also utilizes individuals' lips in order to be able to understand what they're saying, right? Not everybody that's in my life, knows sign language. And so I will have to write back and forth with them, or I will use their lips to support what it is that they're saying, and do the best I can. But only about 30 to 35% is identifiable on the mouth. And we're talking about the best lips, the best lighting, all circumstances being awesome, not Zoom. So, but then you put a mask on somebody, and again, you've eliminated that. So it has a very distancing. There's already this gap between being a deaf individual and connecting with hearing people, and then you put a mask on, and it deepens that gap even further. And so one of the things we just got was face shields that are clear. And so you put on a face shield and it's clear, so you can see the face, you can see the mouth, everything like that. And then organizations where we have deaf individuals that are in the shelter or that work with those organizations and we work with them, we're going to be working with them in order to ensure that they are getting face shields and doing everything we can in our power to assist them with that process.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's a great question about face masks, and it is a game changer. It really is. And my wife and I have been very careful about going out. We're actually taking care of our 1-year-old grandson, and we have 5 kids, and the daughter that has our 2 grandchildren is an essential worker, and so she has been having to go to work. So we've really been hunkering down to protect all of us. And so I don't go out very often, but I have gone out a few times, and when I've been around people with face masks, it's been upsetting. And so we've talked about it and processed that. And so I know if I'm feeling this, I'm not alone.
Yeah, and just as a side note, Stephanie, I have met your grandson on a Zoom call, and he is just adorable.
Yeah, he's ridiculous. Nobody should be that cute.
He is incredibly cute.
Thank you very much.
Well, yeah, Stephanie, I really appreciate you explaining both the importance of the crisis line and all of the services that it offers, but then also speaking really specifically to the difficulty that deaf and hard of hearing individuals have with face masks, both for themselves and in communicating with others. And thinking about it from that accessibility perspective as well, you know, whenever we have our leaders giving press conferences and briefings, it's really important to pay attention to if they have an interpreter signing as well. And I know that you raised that concern really early on. And whenever we are doing any form of crisis communication, it's so important that we think about that accessibility piece.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, it is in every situation when we have a dynamic of a marginalized population in the mix, it really does create a great deal of awareness, right? We may not be able to satisfy all of the needs of that marginalized population, but at least we begin asking questions. And so how great is it, you know, that we in the state of Missouri, I believe, are leaps and bounds ahead of a lot of states, especially in victim services, because DeafLEAD is here, and that's awesome, right? And we are able, because of federal funding, to be able to support other states as well in figuring it out on their end, right? And collaborating with other organizations. I think one of the questions that you asked me early on that I didn't touch on completely, Matthew, was what are the services that the organization DeafLEAD actually does? You know, I don't think I really covered all that we do. I talked about the seed, but I didn't talk about the growth. Obviously, crisis line services is one part of what it is we do, and it's a large part of what we do. But we also do medical, legal, and personal advocacy. We do crisis intervention, not just through crisis line services, but through other ways as well. We relocate deaf individuals who are victims of crime and assist them in either getting into shelters or getting them into their own housing. We, on a contingency basis, you know, case-by-case basis, can provide transportation to deaf individuals as needed. And we also have a program that I'm incredibly proud of, and 3 of the interpreters right here are the 3 people who lead the way in this, but it's our free interpreting for deaf victims of crime. So organizations, you know, this was something I dealt with for so many years. Shelters just couldn't afford to provide interpreting services for deaf victims of crime. So we would get them into the shelter, but then, you know, deaf women will come and go from a shelter 14 times, double that of a hearing woman, because of the communication, the inaccessibility. And so I wanted to have interpreters be available, but there was never the funding available to be able to do this. And the VOCA funding that became available really offered that opportunity. And it has been a game changer for deaf victims that we work with, for the agencies that we provide services for. And I have, you know, 3 of the most amazing interpreters working with organizations all over the United States. It's awesome. And I'm incredibly proud of that service. We offer free mental health services, so counseling services for deaf victims of crime and their family. And then just emotional support as needed through our crisis line services. We have our Missouri crisis line, the deaf crisis line, which is a video phone crisis line, and our crisis texting services. So those are just some of the things that we provide. But basically, if an individual is a deaf victim of crime or a victim of crime, hard of hearing, late deaf and deafblind, but we also work with hearing individuals, you know, but our primary focus is on making sure that our services are accessible no matter who they are.
And Stephanie, another service I know that you all provide that I don't really think that you've talked about is the incredible and generous training that you provide organizations around the state. I've had the privilege and honor to sit in several of your trainings, but also some of the other staff from DeafLEAD, the trainings that they do. and they're phenomenal. So I also want to put a plug that if there is somebody listening to this and it's like, you know what, I don't know a lot about the deaf community, I would really like to know more, what we can do to provide services, how we can reach out into our community. I want to put the plug in, call DeafLEAD, because you all will help with that. The other thing that as you were talking too, that I thought about is, you know, over the last however many years, we have really had a concerted effort to talk about language access. And I do believe that sometimes people forget that what Corey currently is doing is language access. And so we think about various languages. ASL is one of those languages, and we need to remember that as well.
100%. Yeah, absolutely. It is one of the most commonly used languages in the United States. You know, and oftentimes I'm educating people about language is not just about another language. It is about making the first language of both individuals accessible. That is making sure you're looking at the person, making sure you're not chewing gum or eating food or looking away. It's about having good communication, and learning those skills can be very important.
Well, Stephanie, I want to shift just a little bit and ask a question that I've really been thinking about since I heard you speak about it a couple of weeks ago on one of our senior leadership calls. So I've been, I think, fortunate enough to be on enough regional meeting calls and senior leadership calls with you to hear just all of the really thoughtful and thought-provoking things that you've brought up in relation to how the work has changed right now. And last week you mentioned the stacking principle, and that many advocates might be feeling this way right now, and you explained what it was. And I just saw this look come over everybody's face of, finally, I have words to how I've been feeling. And I really wanted us to take time to lift that theory up and have you explain it to more folks. So can you kind of talk about that stacking principle?
Yeah. Basically, in a nutshell, we're all dealing with, you know, the COVID-19 umbrella that is impacting all of us, right? But Matthew and Laura, we all also have things that we deal with in our daily lives, okay? So I'm gonna give you an example. You wake up in the morning and you're out of toothpaste, right? And it's like, oh my gosh. Well, what would we normally do? We would go get toothpaste. We'd put that on the list and we would go get toothpaste. But let's remember that was pre-COVID. Now it's like, where's my face mask? Where's my hand sanitizer? So let's add that on top, right? So we've now got toothpaste and all that means that we need, right? We go ahead and we get the last bit of the toothpaste out of there and we put it on there and we do the best that we can. We shower, do everything, get dressed, go downstairs, and our Pop-Tarts are gone. So now at Walmart, now I'm talking about Hy-Vee, you know, so now I've got to add on to, that's the next thing. Now I've got 2 places of exposure, right? I go through my day and the dog needs to go out. So I let the dog out. The dog comes back. The dog is limping. The dog now needs to go to the vet. And we've got another thing to stack on top of that. And my ear is hurting a little bit. And we stack something on top. And it is like this one thing after another. Now, normally what happens with the stack is it just goes down during the day. As you're dealing with things, they just go down and they naturally, you know, they just don't overwhelm you. Now, what we're seeing happen is the stack just keeps, one thing goes on top of the other, on top of the other. And people are overwhelmed. I mean, I get goosebumps even just talking about it, because, you know, you have to remember that I'm a psychologist. And so I see things through a mental health lens, and working with the clients that I work with, and the issues that they deal with. Again, having 5 children ranging from ages of 26 to 17, having 2 grandchildren, one that's 4 and one that's 13 months, having a wife, having, you know, having the people, having my 80-year-old parents who just moved to Columbia a few, you know, last summer. So all of these individuals, plus the individuals we serve, and seeing the stacking that's happening, and it's not going down. And it's not going down for everybody. So finding ways to ensure, you have to become, so before most people, it naturally happens. They have the coping mechanisms in place and the self-care strategies in place for those naturally to go down. And when we start noticing them, then that's when we start going, I might need to go see somebody, or I might need to talk about this with someone, or whatever. But now everyone really has to become aware that this is happening. We're in for a marathon, not a sprint. And we have to start behaving and thinking about it in that way. And I think the more self-aware we can become, the more we can reduce that stack, because we as providers are dealing with other people's stacks. And that just comes on top of our stack sometimes. So it's essential that we become very self-aware about self-care.
Yeah, I've really appreciated when you do talk about it, because I think that I've had conversations with several executive directors of DVSV programs who have said that it feels like every decision that they are making is an ethical dilemma. And your example of the toothpaste, and that you might have to actually go out to get toothpaste, in some respects, something that simple is an ethical dilemma. You know, and that's toothpaste. And so with all those other things that you're talking about, plus the work itself, it does just make perfect sense why people are feeling overwhelmed and exhausted.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you know, it's kind of like when I'm asking folks about their stress levels, right? I'm asking, you know, how are you doing? You know, what's your stress level? So you'd ask things like, are you feeling overwhelmed? Are you feeling worried or tired? Are you getting too much or too little sleep? Are you gaining or losing weight? Think about all of these things. Are you feeling overwhelmed? Sure. We all are. Are you worried? We're all worried. Just the toothpaste example can set people into a spin cycle of, if I go, what will happen? If I don't go, what does that mean? I'm not going to be able to have clean teeth. You know, if I go, do I wear a face mask? Do I not wear a face mask? Are other people going to be practicing social distancing? Am I going to practice it appropriately? What if someone bumps it? It just is overwhelming, folks. So again, taking care and being cognizant of those little things and doing things to manage that is so important.
It really is. And I don't think I can stress the importance of how much it means that you consistently bring that up as a reminder for people. Because I think we do need that reminder, and we need to not only be self-aware to check in on ourselves, but give that reminder to other people. And I really appreciate how often you do that.
You know, we work in a field where we got to have it together. we've got to be the rock that other people can lean on and stand on, whatever we have to be, and we've got to provide service. We feel this pressure having funds that are given to us. It's a huge responsibility. We want to make sure that we're getting the biggest bang for, you know, the buck that we receive. And then there is also, on some level, this competition of, you know, we don't want it to be there, but the reality is you know, that it's become much more of a numbers game than it ever used to be in terms of provision of service. Whether right or wrong, and I believe that is the worst way of looking at it, that is the reality, right? And so when the numbers start declining and fewer people are coming in for services because of COVID, it's like, what's going to happen? Am I going to lose my funding? You know, there's so much stress. And so it's very difficult for providers who are providing an essential, you know, service, even though we may be doing it remotely or whatever, to express those weaknesses, which that are not weaknesses, but they identify it that way, right? Not that. But so many individuals see that as I'm doing less than. You know, I cannot let on that I'm having this struggle. And I want it out there on the floor for everybody to talk about, or at the very least to listen to.
Well, another service that DeafLEAD is getting ready to provide that I think ties directly into this conversation about self-care is that you all are getting ready to start providing trauma-sensitive yoga as a service to other service providers, advocacy organizations. And I'm wondering if you can talk a bit about how you all decided that this was a really important service for you all to start doing as well.
So we have a social worker that works out of our St. Louis office, and her name is Stephanie Taxel. We call her Taxel because obviously we share the same name. So Taxel is very much into alternative strategies for managing PTSD and stress. So where I tend to be more of a traditionalist in terms of talk therapy, dealing with the emotion and mind, in terms of talking about it, developing strategies, she looks at it in a much more alternative way. She's very involved in yoga. She is a vegan. She's camping, and you know, so she's just in a very much more earthy way thinks about the mind, body, and soul, right? And so she had been talking to me about this TCTSY, that's the Trauma Center's Trauma Sensitive Yoga. And they don't like calling it that, but they haven't found a better way to really label what it is that what they do. But they went through one of the trainings that they provided, both Stephanie Taxel and then one of my Columbia social workers, Becky Beck, who's actually been working with me for almost 20 years and volunteered with the organization before that. So she has gotten involved in the trauma-sensitive yoga as well as another social worker that works at the agency, and she is deaf, and her name is Ashley. So Taxel, Becky, and Ashley are really the three individuals with our organization who are going to be going through the intensive TCTSY program that will, and the idea behind this is we all understand yoga is much more directive, right? So when you go to traditional yoga class, the individual who is leading yoga tends to be much more directive. Put your body in this position, you know, but it's all centered on releasing stress, releasing endorphins, and improving the mind, body, and soul. TCTSY or TSY is much more focused on invitational language. So inviting the person to move their body in ways that allows them to be very aware of what they're doing so they can move it or not move their body. So it's kind of like, now I'm going to be lifting my arm, and you may want to lift your arm as well. And then they talk you through that experience. Think about how you're feeling right now. And is there a part of you that's hurting? Is there something that feels good? Why does it, and really talking through the emotional part of it and making that connection between body movement and the emotions that you feel is a fantastic method when working with women who have been victims of domestic and sexual violence.
Yeah, I love this idea behind it, because something that we know is we carry trauma in our bodies in different ways, and that stress that we carry in our body in different ways. And so the way that you're talking about it, with it being trauma sensitive, is you're having a conversation with yourself about, if I feel trauma in this one part of my body and it doesn't feel good to keep doing this movement, I can give myself permission to not do it. And that you are really having that deeper connection between your mind and body as a way of really holistically feeling better. And I really like this idea of invitational language with it.
Well, and I was also thinking about, when we're working with survivors, we know that so many choices were made for them. And this is a way for them to make the choices that feel right within this movement, within, how they're going to move to the front of the mat or raise their arm, or which direction they're going to go with that. It gives them the choice.
And that's so important. That is so important. I think that understanding our bodies and feeling safe in our bodies is really important work when working with victims of domestic and sexual violence.
And I think that it's so amazing that you all are going to be offering this service to other service providers, so that it's something they can practice if they are feeling that vicarious trauma, or if they have any other trauma they're carrying in general. And so kind of tying that back to what you were just talking about with, as providers, we need to be really self-aware that we're practicing self-care. And this sounds like a really great opportunity for other advocates to practice.
Yeah, it's phenomenal. And I'm so excited to be able to offer this services to organizations all over the state. We have done it at our office. And I will be honest, I am not a yoga person, right? I don't camp. I don't do yoga. I'm not vegan. I eat meat. But when Taxel approached me, she's like, I really would like to do this with the office. And we'll do it in our chairs. We'll do it during a staff meeting. It blew my mind. We did it maybe 20 minutes. And when Stephanie did it, it wasn't her typical presentation, like how she presents herself. She transformed into a totally different person. It was really exciting. I personally, I'm going to be very honest about this. I was very resistant to the idea. I'm self-conscious, and I'm much more about talking about it rather than doing the feeling and the emotion, the moving and all of that. I was very self-conscious, and it changed my mind completely in 20 minutes. Never thought I'd be sitting here talking about trauma-sensitive yoga and really trying to motivate other organizations in the state to give it a try for their staff, and then if they like it, with the individuals that they're working with at their shelter or within their organization, providing it through Zoom, because it really changed my perspective on it.
Hearing you say that, it made me think of one other thing, tying it back to the conversation we had just earlier about accessibility. And so with it really focusing so much on invitational language and being able to have that choice for yourself. This sounds like a great opportunity for individuals who might not have traditionally thought about yoga because they might have some kind of limited mobility, or there is an anxiety about participating in a group with people in something that is so directed. But with this being really invitational, it makes me think this is also such a great way of having it accessible to so many more people who it can help.
Absolutely. Also organizations that have been saying things like, well, we're already doing yoga at at our organizations, or we have office chair yoga that we're doing. This is different from that. This is not, in fact, even the fact that it has yoga in it is just because of the manipulation of your body and the things that you are invited to do. But it really is different. And I really hope we have the opportunity to work with other organizations, and through that experience, they will share, hopefully, with other organizations the positive experience that they have, so that more people will try it out. It's just a phenomenal program, and I'm really impressed by it.
And so it really is, it sounds to me at least, obviously each individual has the choice to move in what direction that they want to, which also means that they are consenting to every movement.
Laura, that's a perfect way to describe that. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, love it.
Well, I'm excited to learn more about this service as you all roll it out, and then certainly highlight it again so that we can really get more people interested in learning about it.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things also that I wanted to make sure I talked about before we close today was, one of the things that has happened as a result of going to the regional Zoom meetings, having the opportunity to go to more because it being so much more accessible. And so I've had the opportunity, because we provide statewide services, I think it's important for me to see what's going on. Where is everybody at in the state? How are folks doing? I think that people often just see DeafLEAD as the organization that serves deaf individuals, and we actually do much more than that. Our focus is providing accessibility, and our focus is on working with the deaf community, but we can also provide other types of support, like with this TCTSY. And another thing that, as a psychologist, that I have been thinking about is I absolutely could work with organizations, their staff, in helping them. We've gotten to the point now where those first couple of months, from March until about now, where we have been putting out fires, or we've been dealing with things, we've been reacting. That's the word I was looking for. And so now, as an executive director, we're looking at ways to, how can we take care of our staff? Because those are the individuals that are taking care of the individuals we serve. And so I'm really wanting to offer organizations across the state the opportunity to talk with their organization, do a training, as it were, on self-care, and talking about that stacking, and specific ways that they can look at themselves and what seems reasonable to them to be able to help them to reduce their stack.
Well, and Stephanie, if you ever come up with the meat eater, no camping yoga, I'm also with you on that one too. So
I'm with you. I'm with you.
So just to kind of close, I always like to end our recording with a random question, but trying to leave it on a really positive note. And so thinking about how I wanted to do that today, I really wanted to just recognize and honor social change markers. So one, congratulations to you, Stephanie, for 25 years as Executive Director of DeafLEAD. And that is a major milestone in and of itself. It's also our 40-year anniversary at MCADSV, and that is another major milestone of social change for our state. So my question for both of you is, what marker of social change can you identify as being really proud of in the work that you've done? And I'll give you a couple of minutes to think about that while I give my own, because I don't want to just put people on the spot. But for me, it was in 2018, one of the legislative priorities that we worked on was updating the human sexuality standards for the state of Missouri. So when school districts provide sexuality education, they now have to include elements of consent, sexual harassment, and sexual assault. And I think it's really great to see that the fields of sex education and sexual health, and then sexual violence prevention, are really beginning to embrace each other. And this month, for example, is Sex Ed for All month. It's the second year that it's actually been branded as that. And I think that's such a really important marker of social change, because as a young person growing up queer in the South, one, I never had access to comprehensive sex education, but absolutely it was not inclusive of LGBTQ individuals. It was not inclusive of really a lot of really specific information that young people need access to. So that's a really proud marker of social change that I've been able to see.
So I'll go, Matthew. To make me choose just one is cruel and unusual punishment. I'm old, Matthew. I have so many. And so I do want to just highlight a couple, and then I'll go to the one I'm going to land on. But anytime that funding actually was put into the budget, we got increases and then more funding at the federal level. I mean, I think that those are always important within this work. The Adult Abuse Act, when it passed, the marital rape law, the Shelter Rules Project to lower barriers in shelter and voluntary services. When programs really took, well, the coalition became a dual DVSV organization, and more programs changed their mission to also include sexual violence, where their focus had been primarily domestic violence. So, I mean, that is just like this tiny snippet of so many important things. But I'm going to choose this moment now, because what I see happening is, as Stephanie was describing, we have spent the last 2 months reacting, but we've reacted in ways that I think we can also take forward. And it is around the accessibility of services. It is around the expansion into more virtual formats for things, so that I don't care if there's a snowstorm and nobody can get to you, or if somebody doesn't have transportation, or whatever it is, that you still can connect with somebody and provide a service. I think that this is going to forever change the amount of beds that we have in a room in a shelter, that we are going to have to reduce the number of beds in each room and how many people we are putting in each room. So I think that my hope is that we will maintain some of the really, really good things that I've seen also happening out of this, that were just these immediate responses that we had to do to try and just get through today. So I'm picking this moment in time.
Nice, Laura. I like that.
I love that.
Thank you.
Yeah, you know, this is what we do here, you know, at DeafLEAD. We do a lot of remote work anyway, but it's always been in our office. So, you know, doing it actually from our homes remotely has been a bit of a change. It was certainly a challenge to get all of our services remote with the volunteers that we work with and our contract workers and things like that. But now that we're remote, it's really working very well. But it's been fun watching other organizations around the state. And I say fun in you know, please, you understand where I'm coming from. But it's been interesting watching organizations who are just so resistant to remote work. And here they are forced into the situation, and they're like, holy crap, that worked. And they're super excited about it and talking about in some of these regional meetings about, I think you guys have posed the question of what things do you see yourself carrying on, and them thinking about that in a different way and going, gosh, we really could do some of these things this way. And they never would have considered it before. And I think that that's a great thing to think about, Laura. I'm so glad that you used that as an example. That's a great one.
Thank you.
So in my answering that question, it is a little different for us because we do not impact policy change in the same way that MCADSV has the opportunity to have its hands in legislation, just because that isn't an area where we have not impacted legislative change for the deaf community. We have an organization, Missouri Commission for the Deaf and Hard of Hearing, that does a lot of the legislation surrounding, and that is, I was fortunate enough to be governor appointed to their board for many years, and had that opportunity when I was there. But there are two things, and they are together really because they happen together for organization, that when I think about change for the deaf community, and really was a game changer for our organization and for the way that domestic violence and sexual violence services are provided for the deaf community, it was huge. And Missouri was so unbelievably supportive of it. And it was our interpreting services and our deaf crisis line. So there are two very different things. One is we have 3 interpreters now that are able to be available. So if a shelter has a deaf victim they're working with and they need to do an intake, all they have to do is contact our organization, and one of these or 2 of these interpreters will be available to provide support. We usually need about 15 minutes, sometimes a little longer depending on if they're with someone else or depending on the time of day, but generally it's about 10 to 15 minutes, and we can get hands in the air for an organization if they have access to Skype, FaceTime, Zoom, or an iPhone, anything, and they're able to interpret. Before, shelters would utilize the children to interpret an intake, which is unbelievably inappropriate. They would have to wait sometimes days for that organization to be able to secure an interpreter to come to that organization. And that interpreter may have no idea what it is to interpret in a trauma-sensitive, trauma-informed way. So really, and it's not just shelters, but they're able to work with law enforcement and legal situations, depending on what that situation is. So there's all kinds of things that they can interpret, and we're sometimes blown away by what it is that it's like, oh my God, that worked. That's so awesome. It was a game changer. And we are the only organization in the nation doing that service. And we all are very cognizant of this moment in time and what it is that we're doing, and trying to be very, thoughtful about everything that we do in every situation that we offer the interpreting. We're not here to remove the responsibility of providing the interpreter from organizations. That's very important. They still have a responsibility to provide the interpreter, but it provides this bridge for them to be able to get the individual into services. And if they do have a financial component where they cannot afford to hire interpreters in their community, that we're still able to provide support to them and make sure that services are provided as smoothly as possible. So that, the free crisis interpreting, and our deaf video phone crisis line, which allows deaf victims of crime who utilize American Sign Language as their first language to call our video phone. And I actually am looking this way because I have my video phone right here. They can call and receive a person live and in that moment to talk to through in American Sign Language in their first language, and that is phenomenal. So I have had the pleasure of receiving the support from our, from VOCA funds and other victim service funding to be able to provide these services. And we at DeafLEAD are very honored and feel very privileged to be doing what we do every day.
Well, those were, and this is for both of you, those were really incredible and yeah, really inspiring and positive examples of social change. And so I think we need to celebrate those wins and remind ourselves of the great work that is happening and the work that had to happen in order to get us to where we are right now. So thank you both for sharing those.
You're welcome.
Thanks, Matthew.
And then I also just want to say thank you so much, Dr. Logan, for being on the webcast this time. It was a really great opportunity to talk with you and also just to lift up all the amazing services that DeafLEAD provides.
Well, thank you so much for having me. This was a